the potential of digital archaeology. For those of you who missed our first afternoon session, my name is Jody Gordon, and I'm an assistant professor of humanities and social sciences here at Wentworth, and also one of the workshop organizers. As an alumnus also of the Department of Classics at the University of Cincinnati, it is now my great pleasure to introduce our workshop keynote speaker, who is Senior Research Associate at my alma mater, John Wallrodt. I still remember the first time I met John over 14 years ago. Yes, it's been a long time. I had just arrived at Cincinnati, and as new graduate students, my cohort and I were required to meet with John as head of computer systems development to talk about computing in the department. As a technology neophyte starting out in archaeology, I remember being intrigued by John's description of his one-of-a-kind role as the department's technology guru, and how he had developed novel data digitization protocols as Cincinnati's excavation at Troy. Throughout my time at Cincinnati during the 2000s, John was always at the forefront of archaeological computing developments as the architect of the department's digital infrastructure and as the data manager for most of UC's archaeological field projects. He was always the first to have the coolest new tech devices, from digital cameras to streamlined laptops to near weightless tablets. For us graduate students, he was definitely one of the coolest department members because he not only loved the past like all of us, but he also seemed to embrace the possibility of better understanding it through digital devices. Indeed, a visit to his office, which was jam-packed with computers, servers, and mobile devices from floor to ceiling, was truly a magical, almost alchemical experience, where one could observe archaeological data being transformed from pencil-written numbers on a page to digital forms that could be skillfully manipulated in visual, cartographic, and statistical ways that shed new light on the past. In addition to his visionary persona, John holds a BA from the University of Maryland in Ancient Studies and an MA in Classics from the University of Cincinnati. In his many years in charge of computing systems at UC's Department of Classics, he has overseen the building of a server-driven archaeological computer lab and has also been involved in many digital publishing projects on materials as diverse as post-Bronze Age ceramics from Troy, to books on Ottoman Greece, to the creation of novel digital scripts and characters for the Bulletin of the American Society of Papyrologists. Moreover, he has become an early adopter of online archaeological data publishing with Cincinnati's new digital repository, Scholar at UC. Yet despite these significant achievements, it is his impressive body of work in archaeological field computing that is most impressive. Since the late 1990s, John has spearheaded the creation of digital workflows as primary data coordinator or legacy data manager on several archaeological projects covering the Paleolithic through Byzantine periods across the Mediterranean world. At Caesarea in Israel, Troy and Granicus in Turkey, Iklida, Pylos, Knossos, and Kea in Greece, Malakastra, Durrës, and other sites in Albania, and finally at Pompeii in Italy. During almost 2 decades in the field, he has built advanced relational databases consisting of both text and images, written a variety of project data protocols, experimented with a host of mobile devices, and has shared his expertise through colloquia on practical field computing and through presentations at the prestigious Computer Applications in Archaeology conferences. More recently, he has also emerged as one of the leaders in creating digital workflows for archaeological fieldwork using post-PC tablet computers as head database manager and digital technologist at the Pompeii Archaeological Research Project at Porta Stabia. His creative use of iPads on the project garnered the attention of Apple CEO Steve Jobs himself and resulted in the creation of one of the seminal blogs for tablet-based computing, Paperless Archaeology, which he actually coined the term, basically, which has shared the Porta Stabia team's experiences with many other projects, including my own in Cyprus, that also recognize the value of interpreting the past through digital archaeology. As a result of these varied adventures in archaeological computing and his singular perspective on the discipline's development, John has truly emerged as one of the pioneers in mobilizing the past and seemed a clear first choice as keynote speaker who might reflect on the potential of digital archaeology. So with these words of introduction, it's a true honor to welcome John Wallrodt to the podium to deliver our workshop's keynote address entitled Why Paperless? Digital Technology and Archaeology. So please join me in welcoming John.
Thank you, Jody. First, I'd like to thank the organizers of this workshop for inviting us here. I've never organized one of these things. It seems like too much work. So I'm always grateful to those that do. And I think that Aaron Averett, Derek Counts, Jody Gordon, and Michael Tomaso deserve as much credit as humanly possible. My aim here is to draw on my 20 years of experience working with data management on surveys and excavations throughout the Mediterranean in order to place the workshop into a historical context. In my discussion, I'll focus on 3 issues that seem central to the theme of this workshop on mobilizing the past. The impact of digital recording technologies in archaeology, both in excavation and survey, or how science fiction became reality. The benefits and potential pitfalls of paperless projects, and future directions for mobilizing the past with the aid of paperless archaeology, particularly concerning the culture of recording. Now, my discussion of the impact of digital recording within archaeology, I'll focus on the examples of Troy, several projects in Western Albania, one is marked MRAP on this map, Iklida near Pylos, Tarps at Pompeii, and Kars on the island of Kea. The path that these projects have taken correlate more or less with what I see as 5 phases of the adoption of digital recording technologies. There's the persistence of paper, the acceptance of digital-born data, technology at the edge of the trench, technology inside the trench, and then direct archaeological recording. This is not meant to mimic the 5 stages of grief, but it fills out. Now, my discussion of the first phase, the persistence of paper, focuses on the Troy project in the mid-1990s. In 1995, when assessing the Troy databases at the request of Brian Rose, I developed a deep dislike for the waste of paper forms. Redundancy and piecemeal completion seem to harbor unlimited opportunities for recording errors. After rewriting the databases with the help of Sebastian Heath, modifying the forms and changing the workflow structure as best I could, I wrote up my report, and inside that document was a statement that seemed like science fiction in the summer of '96, but turned out to be a surprisingly accurate prediction of where we find ourselves today. Now, before going to Troy, I hadn't designed an excavation database. However, I had an understanding of what a relational database could do and some ideas for how to streamline the project's workflow. The Troy project began 8 years earlier, in 1988, as a joint venture between the Tübingen University and the University of Cincinnati. Those universities divided the excavation chronologically. So Tübingen was called the Bronze Age team, and the Cincinnati group was referred to as the Post-Bronze Age team. And each team was responsible for the documentation of their own work, divided at the year 1000 BCE. So rather than a single project database, there were always 2 separate ones, one for the BA data and another for the PBA data. And the data itself was different enough between these 2 periods. And this slide shows one of the reasons why. This is the excavation yard. The parking lot is below the image, the dig house is above the image, and the sidewalk running up the center of the image divides the Bronze Age pottery processing area on the left from the post-Bronze Age pottery processing area on the right. Now, this is all just pottery excavated that 1 year. So the data set for this project is absolutely huge. And the overwhelming amount of pottery that we, the PBA team, and Sebastian's probably having flashbacks, needed to process required different techniques, such as sampling strategies that the BA team just did not use. So in 1995, the PBA data set consisted of 28 DBF database file format tables, which described only the objects, pottery, small finds, and the photographs of those objects. 28 was a lot of tables for this kind of data, but part of that had to do with the maintenance and transportation of the files. There was no network at the time of Troy, and the data was exchanged via floppy between laptops. Now, this is what my initial analysis of the DBF tables looked like. Each column is a table, and the rows are the fields that correspond between the files. They don't always have the same name, but they do have the same data. And here is the whole thing with all 28 slides. I have this actually printed out in my office. And there was a lot of paper at Troy. Again, just for the small finds, we had a UC Fundheft form. Now, this records the existence and the context of an item. The small finds tracking form. This is a second list for the same finds, but this one's meant to track the items through conservation, registration, photography, government review, and storage phases. We had a standard conservation log for items in and out of the conservation lab. And then we finally get to something that looks like a standard inventory form. This is 2 pages, unless it's a lamp, in which case it also gets an inventory lamps form, which is 4 pages. And that's not all forms, I just ran out of slide. So there's a green notebook. Now this is inventory numbers have been pre-written in a hard-bound green ledger book. So you can see the tidy handwriting on the left with all the TC numbers. And then the other columns are for the excavation data, the excavation date, the field serial number, the registration date, that sort of thing. Well, then you have to take pictures and document them. So we had a photo listing. So the item goes in the middle, the item number goes in the middle. On the left-hand side, you write down what roll and frame number you shoot in black and white. On the right-hand side, you write the roll and frame number for how you shot it in color. Then there's the final tracking list. I actually don't know what this does. And as you can guess, since there's more room on the slide, the final tracking list is not the final tracking list, because you have a container tracking form. Now, this is just in case you needed to, actually look at something that had been previously put into the container. And if you did look at that object and you wanted to add to its record, there was an inventory addendum form for you to fill out so that the data could be added to the database and, I suppose, the paper forms. Now, this doesn't even include the pottery. I just got tired of putting forms up on the screen. That's 10 pieces of paper to tell you what and where something was. And most of these forms were just handwritten, unsortable lists. And to find something, each of these pages had to be consulted. Finding a specific artifact took a great deal of time. But what really got to me was this one form, the print request form. Ponder it. You're meant to fill this out and get it approved, apparently, in order for you to get the results of a query from the database. Or to put it in another way, this is how the workflow goes for just this one form. So say you see something interesting and you write that data down on a piece of paper. Then you type that data into a computer. Then you fill out a second piece of paper asking for the data from the first piece of paper, which they run in the computer and give to you on a fourth piece of paper, or on a third piece of paper. And yes, in case you're wondering, they printed out the entire contents of the database every year as a backup. But that's a lot of paper. And yes, I'm picking on an early project, but even the 2007 Archaeologist's Fieldwork Companion included templates for 76 different forms. And the 2010 Standards of Archaeological Excavation contains a PDF of 53 forms and 112 pages. Troy was begging for a paperless solution. From our perspective now, the solution is obvious, and it was to me at the time, but it took some convincing. I had connected some computers together at the site with phone net boxes, and 5 of us could access the newly combined relational database at the same time. This is my first network diagram from my report. I then set up a digital workflow for the finds. So from 1996 and onwards, when the finds were brought into the processing area, we first entered their existence in the database, not paper. The process of moving things around the physical rooms and storage drawers of the dig house were tracked by date fields in the database and the layouts that allowed sorting by number or date of entry. And at the end of the process, we would print out a small finds form that looked like the old small finds form to include in the paper archives, which I suppose are still at Troy. Changes to the record would then happen in the database, but would not be transferred to the forms. The amount of time saved was staggering, and the new ease with which we could actually put our hands on wanted artifacts dramatically increased. And then in the end of my season report, documenting the history of the database and my conversion to a single recording system in '96, I wrote a paragraph with a subheading, Science Fiction. And yeah, I'm going to read the whole thing. As computers become more useful for archaeologists, there will be more ways to use them. With the existing technology, the notebooks in the field can be replaced with handheld Newton devices with database software. Upon entering the compound, this data can be directly imported into FileMaker Pro, and the Tagebooker, including the handmade drawings and scanned negatives, can be produced 100% electronically. Within a small period of time, and a digitized plan of the site, these finds can be mapped immediately, and plans can be automatically updated through the season. Just something to think about. So 20 years ago when I wrote that, it seemed just that, science fiction. And for the first decade of the 21st century, there still weren't that many project directors who were interested in direct data entry. It wasn't until 2010 at ICLNA that I worked with a team that wanted to enter finds directly into their computer. Progress happened, but it was slow. And I think the acceptance of born digital data happened because of the commoditization of irresistible hardware, something that is of special interest to this workshop. The interval from 2000 to 2010 is significant in this regard as it ushered in the ubiquity of both the laptop computer and the digital camera. Now, laptops had already been used as field computers before I got involved. The advantages were obvious, especially for American field projects abroad. They were portable, they had batteries to keep working through power outages, but they were underpowered compared to desktops, and they were expensive. The turn of the millennium saw better laptop performance, and by 2002, most archaeology faculty at UC Classics had switched to laptops as their primary computers and were using them year-round. At the same time, digital photography was becoming useful. In 1998, I brought the first project digital camera to Troy for tests. Okay, so the color, the resolution, and the focus are not very good, but the technology was promising. Then by 2001, we had the first real digital image workflow at Troy. Its application was limited because we only had one camera and we use it mostly for object shots. By 2003, all UC Classics field projects used digital photography. And by 2005, it had become the norm for most project participants to bring their own laptops and digital cameras to field projects. Therefore, BYOD, or bring your own device, is a fairly large but unrecognized phenomenon in archaeological computing. On the left is a photo from the dig house at Troy in 2002. All of the computers there on that project were purchased by the project. The pictures on the right is parts in 2014. All the computers shown here, and there are others not shown, are their own. Pompeii does own a few machines, but only a server and a couple of others. Rather than recording data on paper, many people, particularly specialists, brought their own computers and digital resource libraries with them. Although not widely acknowledged, specialists were thus early adopters of born digital data, in that they created data sets directly on their computers in a format that could be imported into the main project database. Similarly, rather than photocopying project materials to take with them to continue their research after leaving the field, they requested documents in digital formats. And with those two devices came the understanding that we could much better leverage their abilities than to simply type in forms that were once handwritten. And once again, it was photography that led the way. Most of the projects in the early years of digital photography still wrote photo lists when taking digital photos. But it soon became obvious that once we could script the data entry for digital photos, as shown here at MRAP in Albania in 2001, this saved a lot of time in data entry. And as long as the photographs were downloaded regularly, say once or more per day, and either the field shots contained a chalkboard or the finds were labeled or nearby, we no longer needed to keep photo lists and notebooks. And yet, even at 2010, and when Cynthia Shelmerdine at ICLNA and her ceramics team started entering their detailed pottery data into the database without the benefit of a preliminary paper trail, this technology was limited to finds processing. The immediate entry of field data was rare. By and large, computers had not left the dig house and moved into the trench. Although laptops were portable and battery operated, they weren't portable enough, and they weren't battery operated enough to make that move, especially where there was no power at the trench. That isn't to say technology in general hadn't been accepted trench side. Archaeologists had always been early adopters of technological advances, so I'd like to quickly look at what's been adopted, how it's been adopted, and lastly, who's actually wielding the technology. Photography, once again, is the best place to start. Michael Schenks in 2013 wrote, "Photographic documentation has been at the heart of archaeological practice since the formalization of the discipline in the mid-19th century," which I think is a fair enough summary. Geophysical survey started in the 1940s and has played a major role in excavation starting in the 1980s. And we've been using aerial photographs and satellite images for just as long. Computer-aided design and electronic distance measurement have been applied to archaeology very early in their development. And if we can say that photography and excavation matured together, then we can also say that database GIS also matured at the same time as Mediterranean surface survey. Photogrammetry, as we've seen, is coming into its own as an extension of standard photographic documentation. And since I'm focusing on field work right now, I'm not listing all of the advances in materials studies. But what all these pieces of technology have in common is that they are pieces of technology. They're pieces because they require special equipment. They're pieces because they require special training. And they're pieces because they live in their own interpretive construct. Except on a geospatial level, they rarely communicate with each other. They're pieces because each piece of tech requires different sets of people. The photogrammetry people are not necessarily the same people who do the remote sensing, nor are they the same people who handle the day-to-day photography or the GIS. I'll come back to this too, because this is a very important part of field resource management. And with the possible exception of photography and EDM, these technologies rarely affect the actual excavators in the trench. That is, they aren't often used by the trench teams. So technology danced around the trench, but didn't come into it. For that, we needed a new piece of technology that did for laptops, laptops did for desktops. Now, as everybody here knows, and as I said a few minutes ago, laptops had huge advantages over desktop computers for archaeologists. They had battery backup and a small form factor to transport overseas, but they were powerful enough to do what we wanted to do with them. But they were still limited. Keyboards got dirty and had to be replaced. Batteries only lasted a couple of hours, and screens were notoriously difficult to see outside. As for more portable devices, I mentioned earlier that I wanted to experiment with the Newton as a field data entry tool. I tried Palm Pilots, saw one earlier, but they were really buggy, and I did not like the fact that the data was completed if the power ran out completely. I wanted to experiment with the eMate, but they were discontinued before I could. I don't know if many people know eMates. eMates were marketed to elementary schools. And it said that when the Apple reps would walk into a room of teachers and administrators, they would start the demo off by taking it from their bag and throwing it against the near cinder block wall and picking it up, opening it, and doing their demo. And I wanted one of those. Now, in 2008, I joined the PARPS project at Pompeii. You'll hear more tomorrow about the project itself from its director, Stephen Ellis, who's here, as well as Eric Paler. So I don't need to say much here, except to say that from 2005 to 2009, excavations were focused on the Insula 8-7 on the left of the green space, and these were recorded on paper. In 2010, we moved to a whole new Insula 1-1 on the right. Now, during this period of the 8-7 excavations, hardware-wise, nothing really grabbed my attention until 2008, when the iPhone was able to run custom apps. The App Store opened in July of that year, and it changed everything. So by August, I had FM Touch installed and the complete contents of the PARPS database on my iPhone 3G. So with the 2-megapixel camera, third-party applications, and all-day battery, I knew that this, or something like this with a better camera, is all that we needed to record field data. In 2009, we ran data entry trials on the phone, and while we liked its immediacy, we found the screen size and the keyboard too small for the amount of data we wanted to enter. This was solved in 2010, with the 10-inch iPad released just a few months before, and with the work already done with FM Touch in the previous year, I was able to design a workflow that allowed 3 trenches in the new Insula at PARPS to run paperless using direct digital entry. That is, this was the first time that I had worked on a project where the tech stopped dancing around the trench and jumped in. We digitally recorded immediate scientific observations while actually staring at the thing being described. Now, before I move to the final phase, direct archaeological computing, I want to stop and talk about a few of the benefits of paperless. And I just want to run through a few examples of the instant and sometimes unexpected or unrecognized advantages of direct entry, especially for the trench supervisors. For example, all trench notebooks that I've seen have some sort of index in them at the beginning or the end to keep the numbering sequence in order and to note progress in the excavation and documentation. This is one from the last year we did paper at Pompeii. This Pompeii one shows the date that the unit was open, the date the elevation was taken, but not the elevation itself, the dates of photography, the plan number that the object appears on, but not the date it was drawn, closing date, bucket count, and I don't know what that last column is. Now on the tablet, but all of this data also appears on each individual SU page. So everything has to be written twice in order to keep track. On the tablet database, all I have to do is make sure that the tablet has the correct name. That is, the device itself has a name. and I make that name to be the name of the trench -1. So this tablet I'm actually staying in front of is named 57,000-1. And then just by opening the database, it runs a script based on your device name and takes you to your trenches list. There's no searches, there's no sorting. And while the database on the tablets is not an abridged one, you have all the data from all the trenches. You can see at the bottom that it's only isolated 192 records for the trench 57,000. So here all I have on the list is open date, close date, type, and short description, but more stuff can be added. Now, one of the biggest problems with data is the ease with which you can make mistakes in data entry. And this is a problem with both paper and paperless data. The two most common mistakes are duplicate numbers and missing data. So in this database, you can't actually duplicate numbers because the blue plus sign on the upper left creates the next record in the sequence. The database also lets the data recorder know if there's missing data. So with the new record, anything in yellow is a field where I expect data to be. And once something is typed into the field, the yellow goes away. We also had a built-in communication system with the ceramics analysis team. The field team can mark a record as priority. And in their list, those priority items show up with a pink background. That priority is communicated to the ceramicists, and when some data is typed into the database by the ceramicist, the field automatically turns green, alerting the trench supervisor to look for the new data. Now, Pompeii is an offline project. For other projects that have better networking, flagging an SU as priority actually sends an SMS message to the necessary specialist. Bing. Another example is the types of information entered into the same record by different people. For inventoried finds, the excavators create the find record down here at the bottom. Then the finds registrar records more data for it, including the assignation of the accession number, which you see on the bottom too, and this appears to the SU record automatically. This cuts down on a lot of duplicate effort. Two different ways of looking at the same data is much better than having to write down the data in two different places. Now, I don't want to go on with this, but I just wanted to show a couple of examples. The full workflow of these years at PARPS is documented on my blog, Paperless Archaeology, along with sample files and a complete copy of the database that we used. I know also that Chris Motz will talk tomorrow about his work with improving database interfaces for his projects. Now, to sum up Pompeii, what we did at PARPS was a proof of concept. We followed the papered production scheme of previous years, but we merely replaced the paper with an appropriate tablet app. The database became our forms, but we still had a data manager because of the complicated syncing issues. TouchDraw became our drawing environment, but we still had a CAD operator to assemble the data into a clean drawing environment. OmniGraphal became our matrix recording device, but it still only produced a document that could be exported and passed around like a paper page. It wasn't integrated into the data set. And Pages became our notebook, but it was still a separate notebook and not ultimately as useful. I'll explain why in a minute. But these were proxy apps, standing in for their paper counterparts. That isn't to say that they didn't improve the recording. Drawing state plans digitally, particularly at 1:1, was pretty mind-blowing, and we got much more spatial information than we ever had before. Being able to duplicate a drawing, remove a few things, and add a few things was pretty nice. And having a library of ready-made symbols and labels made things even easier. And having an easier way to create and circulate the matrix drafts gave everybody on the project a much better big picture of what was going on. As I mentioned, the notebooks could have been better. Pages was great, but we lost some spontaneity with field sketches that the trench supervisors used to work out the stratigraphic sequence for themselves. But now I want to focus on who's using the tech. Because what we found out is that the training necessary to use these proxy apps ended up segmenting the field teams. While it's one thing to train students to properly measure, scale, and draw ground features on paper, it's another thing to add the complexity of drawing with vectors on glass, having a proper layer structure, and systematically using proper naming conventions for documents. Some people made that leap and some didn't. And those that did became the drawing specialists for that trench. When we had 4 trenches going, we had 4 teams of 2 dedicated to drawing. It's not to say they were drawing all the time, but all the drawings were produced by them. And this type of segmentation carried on down through the various data recorded in these proxy apps. The person writing the database descriptions was not necessarily the same one who wrote the notebook entry or who edited the matrix or who took the photos. Each team had people dedicated to these tasks, and each of those people required training. Now, Pompeii switched to digital midway through its excavation program. The proxy app approach was necessary to have continuity with the previously excavated material and metadata from the 8-7 insula. But what about starting a project from scratch? Can we make the leap from proxy apps to the next step, direct archaeological field computing? I had an opportunity to get closer to this, the CARS project, survey project on KEA. Now, I want to give a little more of an introduction to CARS since it's a largely unknown project because it's so new. The KEA Archaeological Research Survey is an international interdisciplinary pedestrian survey conducted on the Greek Cycladic island of Kea, directed by Joanne Murphy from UNC Greensboro, under the auspices of the Irish Institute of Hellenic Studies at Athens and the 21st effort of prehistoric and classical antiquity. The SURFER survey has three main aims: to test the longevity of surface methods using KEA as a case study, to record new archaeological sites, and to digitize the landscape and distribution of cultural artifacts. I've been part of the CARS project since the early planning stages and was able to shape it as a totally paperless project. CARS uses tablets instead of notebooks and papered maps. Now, technologically speaking, surveys have had a spatial advantage over excavation. Surveys had much easier to use GPS than total stations often are, and have been widely using it since the US unscrambled the satellite signals in 2000. But the actual mapping of tracked polygons had been possible only through specialized hardware and expensive proprietary GIS software. There's long been a need for a better solution than handheld GPS and paper maps and survey. This is a hand-drawn map from 2002 from the Albanian MRAP project. We had GPS that year, but we could only use them to take points in the field. We couldn't match the already drawn tracks with the points from the device until they were both brought back to the house. In other words, we couldn't use the device in the field to double check our position. One of the techniques we developed at CARS was to use GPS location on their otherwise offline tablets to place themselves in space to draw their tracks with IGIS software. Never before had we been able to achieve this kind of visual detail in the field. Using georeferenced satellite photography and IGIS not only allowed us to make sure that we were on the right slope or on the right side of a path, as we could do with 1 to 10,000s that we usually use, but now we can count the rows of olive trees and make sure that we draw the track based on that location. This technique developed at CARS is already being used on other projects around the Mediterranean. And there are several systems being presented at this workshop that address this need to remove the proxy apps and bring the data entry closer to the real analytical systems that we use, be they CAD, GIS, or strict database. And I look forward to hearing about each one. Despite the success of these developments, putting this kind of technology into the hands of the trench and survey teams does raise considerable problems. The most challenging of them is training, which brings me back to an old issue in archaeology of the specialist versus generalist nature of the member of the field teams. I'd like to now explore these issues. Let's go back to photography, because I think that the history of the adoption of this once very complex technology can serve as a template for other technologies. By now, there's an old debate that's been going on since 35mm photography. Should you have a specialist for field photography, or do you leave that to the hands of the excavation supervisors? Even by the mid-1970s, publications concerning the issue had ceded the duties to the trench supervisor. The anthropologist Elmer Hart Jr., on his book on archaeological photography, put it this way: on balance, it seemed to us that we might successfully encourage an archaeologist to become a reasonably competent photographer, whereas it could be far more time-consuming to turn an expert photographer into an acceptable archaeologist. Which is a very practical consideration and reflects my own experience. In my first season with the University of Maryland work at Caesarea Maritima and Israel in 1994, all photography was done by one professional team. At Troy, there was a mixture. We had 2 full-time photographers. One was usually in the house photographing finds, and the other had scheduled times for each trench when the sun was best for that area. And that's what Dr. Gebhard Bieg is doing on the top of that ladder on the right. Each trench team, however, had their own 35mm film camera and would take any necessary immediate photos themselves. In the digital period, post-Troy, we seemed to only use specialized photographers for finds photographs and not for field shots. But Dr. Harp also expressed the other side of the argument with equal persuasion. Speaking of photographers, he wrote, "We all know that the increasing complication of contemporary archaeological method requires an ever greater dependence on the skills and artistry of such people." And that's the part I want to cling to for a while. Because by solving this increasing complication of contemporary archaeological method by training the trench team to photograph does not, in my experience, scale well. You can't keep using this for each new piece of recording. In addition to photography, documentation for excavation has increased over the decades with the increase in spatial recording, more complex environmental and geomorphological sampling strategies, and more quantification for finds. We're measuring, sampling, weighing, and counting more than we ever have before. Then, when the tools to record become less familiar than a piece of paper divided into a standardized form, I wonder if the old solution to the increasing complication of contemporary archaeological method, that is to train the trench supervisor to do it, will scale to include both the increased data collected and the increasingly complicated method with which to collect it. I would therefore like to examine, with a fresh eye, the specialist versus generalist debate as it concerns the culture of trench recording in general. Because we already have specialists nearby, geologists, geomorphologists, environmental specialists, ceramicists, and others already float from trench to trench, and we like this technique. If we place the responsibility for the enforcement of a site-wide sampling strategy on the environmental team, say, then we have a greater chance of having site-wide data. Jack Davis at the Bonjaket excavations near Apollonia, Albania, for example, employed a geologist who examined and described the matrix of every stratigraphic unit, providing a consistently described soil profile for the entire excavation. With the increase in trench recording technology being used on a daily basis by the field team, and the specialist knowledge and training that these techniques require, I'd like to propose that we re-examine the single trench supervisor model of excavation. This model has hardly changed from the origin of the discipline. What we have now is that for almost all information, save finds information, everything is filtered through the trench supervisor. That person is not only responsible for directing where to dig, and more importantly, where not to dig, but also the assignation of the many numbers generated by fieldwork and other metadata associated with the trench, bucket counts, samples, elevations, drawings, photographs. And even some of the specialist descriptions get filtered through them. For instance, the geologist might have something to say about the soil matrix while visiting the trench, but it might not all get recorded or recorded properly by the trench supervisor. And one of the reasons that it has survived this long, more or less unquestioned, is because the key to everything that we know about the space was held together inside the trench supervisor's physical notebook. That object, full of paper, held all of the data sheets, all of the drawings, all of the observations and notes for the space. If anybody wanted to examine the work done so far, they had to read the notebook. Even after much of the information had been typed into a database, the notebook was the data. But with digital trench recording, the notebook is no longer a valid construct. The notebook isn't the data anymore. Now the data is the data. The digital methods that we will examine in this workshop are the tools by which the data will be created, stitched together, digested, and saved. So if we extend the definition of specialist to include the requirements of the various pieces of individual trench recording, then we might have a more effective overall data collection strategy. If one team were to handle all of the field drawing to project specs, then we could rely on more consistent drawings. Or to paraphrase Dr. Harp, I can teach 2 archaeologists to be excellent illustrators, or I can teach 8 archaeologists to be mediocre illustrators. If there's a single source for geomorphological descriptions, one source for the architectural descriptions, and on down the line, through each of the components necessary for the required documentation, then we could have teams moving from trench to trench, recording their observations using the exact same skills, methods, and ontologies. We would therefore have a much cleaner, usable overall data collection strategy. In this model, the organizer, the trench supervisor of yore, would focus only on their most immediate task, which is the excavation, understanding, and interpretation of the stratigraphic sequence. Now, years ago, I had a discussion with Jack Davis about a proposed data collection change for one of his projects. His response was, but then we wouldn't be able to record everything we know about it. and he was right. For field computing, pulling the data out of the notebooks and off of the paper allows us the chance to rethink our trench management structures and figure out the best way to create much fuller, consistent data sets. It is the best way, in my opinion, that we can deal with both the increasing complication of contemporary archaeological method and record everything that the collective team knows about the unit. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. If anyone has any questions for John, I'd really like to thank you for this incredibly insightful view of like how we have been doing archaeology over time, and also thinking about like how is the technology affecting the way we do this and how we should use it and why we're using it, more importantly. So I'd just like to open it up a little bit. If you would take a couple questions, John, I can run around with a microphone.
So I guess it's on the last one. So is what you're thinking as a better division of labor, something along the lines of, so the trench boss is really overseeing the physicality of the excavation, keeping track of how to code stuff because he knows the stratigraphic relationships between them and so forth. But then another team comes and they're the data backings with doing the photogrammetry, for example, because they're trained to do the photogrammetry and that's their job.
Right.
So I think that probably is the best compromise, but I think the compromise is that so the data that gets created by the photogrammetry team, in a sense, I mean, they don't understand that data, right?
Well, at projects that I've worked at that use photogrammetry, they're not going to see it for the field season. So, because it takes so long to process it, and they're taking so many of them, that I don't think they get them before the field season ends. So what I'm getting at, though, is that it's the trench supervisor is still going to probably write the final report. But they're going to get information that's not just the information that they wrote down. They're going to get information that they wrote down about the stratigraphic sequence. But every time they need to refer to a soil profile, they're going to be reading somebody else's data every single time, and not something that they wrote. So, yeah, I think they're going to get much purer data, and we're going to get less objectivity or subjectivity.
I think I can do it. Good. So I had a perspective question, like your perspective. Sorry. A question based on like a perspective question, like because you had this interesting kind of you look at data from different projects, but also at different times. And one question that you get in, whenever you talk to someone, especially colleagues, for example, who aren't quite ready to do all born digital data, is well, aren't you just doing the same thing, right? Aren't you just doing what you did in paper now, with a tablet? Okay. So the question of is it different data? Is it more data? Is it better data? Is it the same data organized differently? I mean, how do you see those kinds of questions, kind of playing out? Just from your own perspective, as I said, it's different for every project, but.
But yeah, there's an almost infinite variety of project organizations. Can the trenches see each other? Do you have power for anything? So you have to do what you have to do for your project. But what I think the direct digital stuff for any kind of project that has any kind of communication with each other, it just allows you to have that instant communication with each other. So you're not waiting for 3 days to find out something that a colleague knows, but you just haven't run across them in 3 days. You're finding out what they know immediately because it plopped up right in front of you. So I think that's one of the biggest advantages, is it could be slightly purer data, and it could be quicker delivery to the person that needs it.
Can I ask a follow-up?
One of the organizers, I can ask you that. Let me rephrase the question.
Okay.
In your experience, just dealing so much, dealing so directly with the actual data being produced by the archaeologists, right? Like all these notebooks coming into offices and being stacked in boxes. From your perspective, is the data better on these projects? Is
data better on
more
paper
data?
projects?
Is it overwhelming now? I mean, you get the impression that we're also producing a lot of born digital data that may, that we're increasing the total number of pieces of data. If that makes sense.
If I understand your question correctly, I think the born digital data tends to be better data, partially because it's reviewed immediately. I can review the trench supervisor's descriptions of their trench every day. And I can walk up to them while things are still fresh in their head and say, look, you said you ran across a small stone. What does small mean? You've got to tell me something. Give me a number, circumference, diameter, anything. But the data store, I try and separate database, which is the interface that people use to access the data, and the data store that sits behind it holds all that data until somebody wants it. So if your analysis that you're doing doesn't really require you to look at the animal bones for a while, then you can ignore the animal bones. But if then you sort of want to bring that into the mix, it's right there. You just bring it right in. So I don't think that you can have too much data. I think that there's a lot of work to do with the interface for bringing it in and hiding it when you want it and don't want it. But,
Ilan Sharon from Hebrew University. Just a short comment about what you said, the photogrammetry not being there during the season. This last summer, I visited Ann Killebrews from Penn State excavation at Akko. They had a system where during breakfast break, they had 3 people per trench cover everything with photographs just from handheld camera. And then between breakfast and lunch, using PhotoScan, they modeled every trench and had it ready, the 3D model to serve as the basis for the daily registration system for the next day.
mm-hmm.
So.
No, it can be. Yeah, it's hard though. We tried it at Canalsas this summer, and there was the person who brought the computer to do the photogrammetry bought a vastly underpowered computer, and so he couldn't get them done in time. He just run for like 12 hours. So we're bringing much better hardware next year, and hopefully we can have that actually be part of the workflow instead of just being this thing that gets plumbed in a folder on the server at the end. Yeah.
Hi, Sean Ross from Florida University. No, I just wanted to agree with you about something and ask you if you've seen this in other projects as well. As we've moved with our mobile platform for data acquisition, we've done deployments in about 2,000 projects now, and the socio-technical barriers are now really, we're running into much more than the strictly technological problems. And this goes back to one of the other questions too. A lot of it seems to me to be the fact that paper can be very quick and dirty. Like, if your form's not quite right, throw it in the nose. If the control book, if the lists, checkboxes on the forms aren't right, pencil something else in. And so you can deploy paper very quickly at the beginning, and then at the end, you get a lot of messy data that it takes years to publish and get out there. And we found it really hard for a lot of the projects that we're on to front load their project sufficiently to do the data modeling necessary to define what they need to record. Then, I mean, if you can drag them kicking and screaming through that process, they're thrilled on the day after the project's over, and here's all of your data structured, clean, ready to go. But this seems to me to be just a change of mindset almost. It seems a very profound sort of socio-technical problem in the field.
It is, and I think that that BYOD, bring your own device slide, represents a cycle of technology. So in a few years, I don't think it's going to be a problem because I think everybody's going to be much more familiar with tablets and what they can and can't do. Their typing is going to get better, their drawings are going to get better, they're going to have more confidence with their finger instead of a stylus. So I think in that way, things are going to get better. But somebody, when I gave this as a practice talk at my university, one of the colleagues asked, so where can you say that we are? She said, from soup to what? Where we are, and my only answer was, we're from primordial soup to soup. I mean, we're still really early in this, so there's a lot of room to improve.
Hi, I'm Eric Hansa with Open Context. I just wanted to follow up on what Sean asked about, this sort of increasing systematization and modeling. I mean, your data management structure there really models things in such a way about trying to shape how people are recording different phenomena that they're encountering, right? So they can't advance to submit that record until they filled out all those different aspects of the form. So I guess one of the questions is, what do they do when they encounter the unexpected that doesn't quite fit the form well? And how does that impact recording? Is it too much work for them to sort of like, oh my gosh, I'm finding something new, I can't make it here, so are they going to just say, well, I guess it's sort of like this?
Well,
and then one more follow-up on that. And now we're entering into a lot of interest. People are wanting to do big data aggregation. Like sort of the small artisanal handcrafted data is not good enough. We want big data. So one of the questions around that is that so some people want to sort of scale that out, not just at the from project, but like lots and lots of projects. So you have to inherit standards from general standards for the discipline. And so the question is, where does that leave the intellectual engagement with pushing against those standards when maybe you need to push against them, and pushing against the models where the models maybe aren't really working well in what you're talking, in what you're observing.
Well, if I could remember your first question. The bit that I showed in the database where things turned yellow unless you type something in and then they went white, we can have several open SUs at the same time. So it doesn't keep you from going anywhere. You can go to the next record and start typing something in. And you don't, when you first open a record, you have to type in a short description, just a few words. And then later you type in your longer one. But the forms that we use, we have a continuity of personnel from the one insula to the other insula. And the forms that we used in the database were straight off of the paper forms that they had been using. So they knew, after 8 years, they knew what to put in what forms, and if they needed something something described that they encountered they couldn't figure out what to do, then I was a few feet away. So I don't think that was a problem. Your other question,
yeah, just about, it's a sort of tension between this sort of global interest in wanting to do this sort of big aggregation, data integration, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Which is, it's valid research, I didn't mean to make it, to disparage it, but also the, what is the role of the space of the researchers in trying to understand a phenomenon and maybe try and push back and seeing where maybe general models don't really apply well for their specific situation, and then they might, so there's is this sort of weight of standards and having these fully digital electronic processes making it more difficult for us to sort of document things that in a way that is a little bit less systematic and that maybe could be useful for critiquing and making better models or making new kinds of models that look at the material in new kinds of ways.
I think my experience with PIs who are starting field projects is different than your experience with PIs who are starting field projects. I mean, most of the time when they say, I'm going to start this new project and we're going to record things this way, it's because that's what they did in their last project or that's what they learned. It's not like they sat around, they shopped around to a bunch of different models and said, oh, I like that one the best. And then we always butt heads because I say, no, but you need to kind of move this way a little bit because that's not really, you can't quantify anything that way. But if you write it this way, you can have everything that you have there, but you can count it. So I would love for standards to develop, but I don't really see, right now I'm at the whim of the PIs. The other thing I noticed, that, because I only work in academic archaeology, is that what PIs will do is they want to do something new, right? Especially because you're doing something new will get you to the top of the grade pile. So you're saying that you're going to dig this spot, and it's a spot similar to other spots that have been dug, but you're going to do this one cool thing that's going to make it different and give you better data. So then you go to do this cool thing, and you need lots of maybe tech or rethinking some database structures or something like that. But the other 90% of the data, you don't want to have to reinvent. So you want to take something that's familiar and something that you know and glom the new technology onto it. And then that becomes your project. And I see that is the pattern that I see with academic archaeology. Less wanting to be standards-based, unless you're one person like Jack Davis who's been doing so much for so long and has been able to have a static data format that he can plug all of his projects into. It just tends to be haphazard.
Hey, I like that. I was wondering, that's all I have. One thing that kind of fascinated me is thinking about working in the field as data collection. And a lot of it seems like your talk's sort of focused on data collection. You know, I come out of second wave surveys and new archaeology traditions, so I'm very comfortable with that. But recently I've been thinking more and more about working in the field as being sort of part of the interpretive process, as opposed to being this kind of, almost a Taylorist approach where you come in and you optimize the bits of data collected. Maybe it's because I live in North Dakota, but I think about harvesting, right? Where the goal isn't to appreciate the amber waves of grain. The goal is to make sure that you have every piece of grain, because grain is money, and then you can appreciate the amber wave of grain once harvest is over or before harvest begins. And so I guess one thing I was sort of wondering is how do you see like the reorganization of the archaeological process as creating room within this limited time in the field that's constantly being optimized and efficient and generated more efficiently. And invariably, right, what happens, I worked on a survey this summer where every minute we weren't collecting data was like minutes lost. And not in a bad way necessarily. I mean, the goal then, every level of gaining efficiency was to move more, to get more data collected. At what point do we say that this pattern that's sort of developed, and yeah, you're right, is being like driven by the increasing commodification of technology, where we're becoming like appendages of machines and functioning increasingly along these lines, which are essentially dictated by like the parameters of computational power as opposed by anything else. But without devolving in sort of a crude Luddism where we smash our iPads and we're finally free to dig a hole however we want. How do we balance these things? Like, I mean, is there a point where we sort of draw a line and say, yeah, I can do this better, but this really is the way that I want to do it, because it's great that they're doing it that way over there, or that the photography guys are coming by in 10 minutes, but I need time to think through this.
Well, I mean, I'm involved in 5 current projects that are a combination of paper and paperless projects. So it's not like I can push this on anybody yet, except Stephen, who's done a list to. But going back to your first example, your threshing. I mean, okay, if you don't want to document the threshing process, you just want to count the seeds, that's fine, because you're going to grow more next year, and you're going to thresh next year. But if you're only ever going to thresh once, then you want to document the process. And since we're destroying, that's why we get so involved in recording things as best we can. We want to know everything that we want to know about this, because we won't be able to dig it again. And so I think that is a respect that we have to give to the past, And I think we owe it to them to try and record it as best we can. Not really sure where I was going with anything else.
Hello, I'm Erin Egbert from Creighton University, and thank you, John, for a thought-provoking keynote lecture. I actually don't have a question myself, but we have a question from the Twitter feed from Clint Dibble, University of Cincinnati, right? Okay, he says, what?
We need a hologram of Clint.
Oh, okay, yeah. I can try to impersonate him. Anyway, he asks, is BYOD a good, bad, or neutral trend for archaeological data collection?
Good. It's all good. If they bring it themselves, they're familiar with it, and they want to learn how to use it. So, the BYOD people that I encountered first were at Troy, where they bring their own digital cameras because they wanted to take study shots of the things because they didn't have enough time to describe them while they were there. And so it was great to see them interested in bringing the technology and using the technology, and then walking up to me and saying, okay, how do I use a spreadsheet? So, boom, they've left more computer literate than they came, and they did it because they own the technology that they can use.
So maybe we have one more question, just to give John a break. Anyone have a question? Okay, one second.
Hi, so it occurs to me that connectivity in the field is a two-way process, and with data being, with data being collected by specialists and transferred to some central location, what opportunity do you see for analyses to flow back to the excavators? Even if it isn't happening in every specialty right now, some of these analyses can be made use of by a trench supervisor or something like that. So in what direction do you see that going?
It used to be that I could not get specialty data, especially from bone people for some reason. They would always tell me that the raw data that we have has to be interpreted correctly, and that the field archaeologist would just make a mess of it. So they didn't want to give us their data. They wanted our data, they wanted the stratigraphy, and they wanted the matrices. But more and more I see them opening up, and I see them saying, look, here's our data, put it in your database, and together we'll work out what it means. So I think it's getting a lot better with that.
Does that then affect the role of the trench supervisor?
No, the trench supervisor is done by that point. I mean, the trench supervisor is in charge of actually getting the stuff done. But by the time you do the flotation, you do the sorting, it depends, again, on digs, whether or not they have it on site. Flotation and sorting usually happens in study seasons afterwards. So at that point, it's left the trench supervisor has written their final report, and they're done, and they can walk away. That's the end of their contract, really. If they happen to be team members who are going to end up writing the final publication, when they sit down to do the re-examination, or Steve sits down to write the end-of-year summary, and if he has the data in time, then he can incorporate it. But these things happen at different times. You get the NAA analysis years later. You have to fit it together as best you can. But if I've got really good stratigraphic data, and I've got really good soil descriptions, I've got excellent architectural descriptions that tell me exactly how these things were bonded and built, then later, when the material stuff starts coming in, it's all going to gel, and it's all going to make a lot more sense. But it comes from so many places.
So I think with that, we might want to give John a break. We could definitely continue this lively discussion, but I'd really like to thank John so much for this perspective. And if I could just have your attention for just a second, just to sort of sum up what we've been doing today. I would like to really thank everyone who has made their way here to be part of this today. I think this is a very vital and important discussion in terms of what is going on in terms of technology and archaeology. I mean, you can see it's not only about like new devices and new types of apps and things like that and new ways to store it and think about it, but it's also about fundamentally what is going on with archaeological method. How is this going to change the way we think about what we do and the way we continue to do it, and especially at a time where the change is happening incredibly rapidly, as Brandon, I think, pointed out. So with that, I'd just like to also point out a few logistical announcements. I'd like to remind everyone that we will have a full day session tomorrow as well, starting at 8:15 a.m. which will actually run for the entire day until 7 p.m. That will be located over in Blount Auditorium here at Wentworth, not in this building we're in today, which is Beatty Hall, but actually just across the quad and across Parker Street. If you sort of go out of the front of Beatty, turn right and head past the tennis courts, which are actually buried in the snow if you can find them, across Parker Street in Annex Central building, and walk straight in that building, and we'll be in the Blount Auditorium and the Casella small gallery right in front of it all day tomorrow. That starts at 8:15 and goes until 7 p.m. So if you can't be here, obviously, we really appreciate everyone that is tuning in live for this, and we encourage you to also tune in for the live stream tomorrow, which we will run the entire day as well. And again, these talks will be also archived on YouTube, so if you want to actually come back and think about it again, some of the things we've heard, we really encourage you to do that. And with that, I think I'd just like to sign off and say to everyone, have a really wonderful evening. We hope to see many of you tomorrow. And those of you who have presented today or are part of our core presenting group, if you could hang around